James, thanks so much for making the time today, joining us on Careers and Finance. Really excited to hear your story. And, let's kind of jump in there. Where have you come from? Where have you worked? What's sort of been your career journey, James?
Yeah, everyone's got a different career, I think, Daniel, and it's one of those sort of interesting things how it works out. And it probably never plays out quite as you think it will on day one, or more to the point, on day one, you probably never know quite what journey you're on. So I think the first thing is don't get wedded on day one to what you may or may not do in your career or achieve, because it is a moving feast. Where you end up, the opportunities that present themselves. And the fact is, coming out of uni, for instance, you don't know half the opportunities out there. So I ended up in a graduate program working for JP Weir initially, going through the sort of different departments there, and that was a great place to start. And really, it was sort of in many ways a blue blood of Australian sort of stockbroking, investment banking back then, and they were a great place to cut your teeth because they were very relationship focused. And I think that's probably a point we might touch back on later, is the ability to sort of work on those relationships, understand them, and keep them for the long term. I think is very important, not only in financial services, but really probably across most industries, to be honest. It was a good place to start one's career at JP Weir, and did myself rotation there, and then went and did a bit of travelling for 6 months, came back and ended up at what was then just becoming AXA Asset Management. It was the old National Mutual, and that's where I sort of moved initially from that sort of IB stockbroking world into asset management. So there was something I wasn't quite expecting on day one, but it probably was the basis of where I went for the next 20 plus years.
So started in that kind of stockbroking model, found your way into asset management by accident?
Yeah, look, I think when you're young, you're looking for opportunities, aren't you? And one happened to present itself there, and I looked at it, and really what it looked like to me at that point, and I'm not saying this is what it is, but as someone was young, green, naive at that point, is that had those elements that you had where I was, but at an institutional level to an extent. So and one of the things we can explore down the road is really that differentiation between institutional models and how you're dealing with institutions versus the retail, what may be high net worth, or even retail mums and dads. And they're really different points that you have to learn how to contend with through your career, how to articulate different narratives, and also the outcomes that you're probably trying to drive. But it was good because that was probably my first jump from being quite retail orientated, if you will, to being wholesale institutional orientated. So I think it was a few years there, but good place to sort of initially find out more about the industry. And just out of uni, that's what you need to be doing, is finding out what you actually enjoy. And I think that's pretty important. No point spending 30 years of your career doing something you don't like.
Yeah. And so then AXA kind of took you down a path of managing equities and portfolio management. What are some of the milestones you've had along that asset management journey?
Look, actually, I think in many ways AXA was that initial foray into there. And then, at that point, I probably worked out, I wanted a bit more, if you will. And that's where I jumped on a plane, went to London without a job. Like many people, did one or two little temping roles till I found a place. And, initially, I landed at Fidelity, which at that point in the year 2000 was the world's largest fund manager with over $1 trillion of assets. And, American culture within there, but a great place to learn fundamental research. So taking on a number of different roles that I found very interesting, learning from different people, being in a far faster paced environment, far more competitive, if you will. And that in itself is a learning curve. A different culture might be another way to put it. And I think that was my first real sort of eye-opening to that sort of really competitive culture. And so I had a period there, then moved to JP Morgan Asset Management. And that was very interesting, where I sort of had 7 or 8 years there in London. And he had just gone through a 3-way merger, if you remember back that far, but JP Morgan, Chase Manhattan, and the old Fleming's business, which was Robert Fleming in the UK, or JF, Jardine Fleming in Asia, had all come together. And you went through a few different guises. But it was a great place to work. I really enjoyed it. Fabulous culture, fabulous people, smart people. people that mentored you well, and maybe that's one of the other important things. One of the things I learnt there wasn't just from good people and learning your craft and your career and how to think differently and how to think in the differentiated manners from your competitors and how to wrap a narrative around that and make sure you're hitting all the different elements. But the mentoring was second to none, and that was something I very much enjoyed. That they were able to make sure they got the best out of me, and that didn't help them then, but also helps me long term. And that's something hopefully as I've taken on then leadership positions down the road in the future, if you will, post that point, that you're always looking at how you can mentor, look after those around you, and help them learn and help them become the leaders of the future. So it was interesting. I think the numbers might be slightly off. It was a while ago now, but I think when I joined there, we had about 16 billion, would have been probably US under management. When I left, it was about 65 over 7 years. And that meant when I got back that just that European equity desk there was bigger than Australian super at that point. And that was at that point Australia's largest super fund. And that in itself just shows you the scale of going overseas, spending some time, get out of your comfort zone. Australia's a great market, but it's a small market. So I've always really prized that international experience very highly. And I think one of the things Australia is not great at is looking at expats returning who have fabulous experience and not utilising that experience of where they're probably, not always, but have possibly worked in larger, more competitive markets, have seen things where you've got more capital, both that you might be managing, but also at your disposal to help grow businesses. That's the sort of best practice that you want to, if it included best practice, that's the sort of thing you really want to be instilling in businesses. So I think that's often a missed opportunity, thinking about your aspect in recruitment and search is looking at those expertise of people who've given their 5 or 10 years overseas. And I did the better part of 10 years, and seeing how you can leverage that in your own businesses. And I think it's something we actually undervalue here to an extent.
Yeah, it's definitely an interesting one. We do see quite a bit of it of guys returning back, and exactly what you say. It's hard for people to understand the difference if they haven't done it themselves. And I've had the joy of working with a few hiring managers who have done it themselves and see a lot of value in those guys. And they kind of I've worked with hiring managers who reference kind of every year in a market like a London or a Singapore or a Hong Kong or even a Tokyo, is probably the equivalent of a year and a half to 2 years in an Aussie market, just in terms of what you'll be exposed to and the levels you'll operate at. So then you did make that move back to Australia.
I came back in the late noughties, and unfortunately at that point, there wasn't really an area for JPM for me to move back here internally with them, and I would have happily done so. And we had discussions, but moved back cold turkey, if you will, and ended up joining a firm called Perennial, who still exists in different guises now, but Perennial was a multi-asset boutique under the IWF banner at that point. And I joined there as a 2IC in global equities, became the head of global equities, ended up running multi-asset, ended up sitting on asset allocation committees and their executive leadership group. And that was 7 or 8 years there, and a great journey as well. So different beats, much smaller, growing, boutique rather than structure. Equity is precious is one thing I always take away. Not only if you're looking after listed or private companies, but also building businesses yourself, the ability to actually own equity. It is precious. Look after it, build it. The other thing that both Perennial and JPM gave me were good friends I still talk to, and I think that's sort of been an important part of the journey as well. But I think I'm trying to think from that, and then after Perennial, I'll come back to a different story, but ended up at a K2 Asset Management as their chief investment officer, looking after a hedge fund, equity biased hedge fund for 3 years, and that was an enjoyable journey. And then since then really been doing a whole of consulting work across superannuation, investment processes, helping fund management companies, and working on my own startup these days, which is also a lot of fun as well, in slightly differentiated markets. So there's a couple of sort of lessons I think I've sort of taken away over that journey. I might be sort of jumping ahead, and I'm sort of trying to keep my for your sake, the sort of search and HR or recruitment hat on, and always think there's a couple of lessons I took away, and people always take away different things. And these things aren't necessarily right or wrong. They're just things that I sort of hold highly. I remember I was at JPM, and every year we'd take on 2 graduates, and we tended to really take our graduates from, I think it was only about 4 universities: Oxford, Cambridge, Trinity, I think it was, in Dublin, and there was 1 or 2 others. There was a very select list, and it may change now, who knows. And the reasoning there was that we suspected after a few years there'll be turnover. You're never going to keep both for life, but the aim was always to try and hire smart people, and if possible, hire people smarter than yourself. And the reasoning was there is, don't be scared about losing your own job to someone. You hire smart people, that will help you grow the business. A rising tide floats all boats. So the fact is, if they do leave after 2 or 3 years, you probably get more out of them than you will out of someone who doesn't have the same calibre and stays for 6 or 7. The other bit is, if they are truly fantastic, who cares if you end up working for someone you hired? The whole aim is to actually grow your business and get the best people in there. And that's something I've always held on to. The other way we used to call it is that A's hire A's and B's hire C's and D's, which comes back to that: hire good people, hire smart people. Never be worried about your own job. Be worried about driving the business forward. And if you're good, people around you are good, you will drive your business forward faster than you would otherwise. And that creates opportunities. Whereas B's tend to be more worried about protecting their own job. And that's where you just tend to stagnate over time. And hopefully, it's one of the great things about financial markets and financial services. It is a dynamic industry. It's constantly changing. And one of the things I really loved is no 2 days are the same. So if that's the environment you always want a challenge as well. And that's why I always believe you can get great people working, especially in asset management, but across financial services as a whole.
And so, in terms of, one of the things I'd love to dig into is running equity portfolios. And you've successfully kind of grown at Perennial. You've then gone to K2 and grown that. But what have been some of those keys in terms of being able to generate the sort of investment performance that helps businesses grow? Because yes, you've got to hire smart people. Yes, there's lots of business lessons and leadership lessons along the way. Fundamentally, if you can't run a good portfolio, it's all going to be for naught anyway. And building what you build, you've learned a lot about running the equity portfolio.
Yeah, look, on that side, the first thing I'm going to say, there is no one right answer and there's no one wrong answer. There's good ways of doing things. There might be better ways of doing things. But what is a good way for me may not be a good way for someone else. We all have our own inherent biases of how we want to manage money. So, I worked out, how I manage money, which had the ability to bring both quantitative and qualitative elements together. Quantitative, one of the reasons we were very successful at JPM is we were at the forefront of implementing behavioural finance, and quantitative methods and optimizers, and looking at those behavioural elements in markets into portfolios. And that also allowed us, one of the things I always cherished was actually outperforming both growth and value markets. And I think, to me, if you're able to get from point A to point B, you'd rather try and get there in a smooth fashion. And what we do see is, funds out there are heavily growth or heavily value. And let's say they can still get from A to B, but they tend to be more exaggerated, in different markets. So to me, that was one thing, looking at how I could leverage what was out there at the time. And going back 20, 25 years ago, it was really looking at behavioural finance, how we could implement quantitative sort of methodology, into interpreting what was happening in markets, and then give us an advantage. And then when I was at Perennial, I took a lot of those learnings and I sort of overlaid, fundamental research on top of that as well. And that produced great performance, but also lower volatility in the market. So outperforming with lower vol in different market conditions. And to me, that's very powerful, but it's also probably quite institutional. And I think one of the things I've sort of seen is that we've moved into a growth market, orientated market for the last 20 years to an extent. Value outperformed for much of the 1900s. Growth has certainly been in the ascendancy through the 2000s. And a lot of that is due to the composition of markets as well. We've gone from heavy balance sheet orientated companies to much lighter, non-capital intensive balance sheets that get much higher ROEs, and that allows for higher valuations, higher returns, and that brings in different nuances how you look at things. But that higher growth is probably here to stay going forward in terms of growth orientated markets. And I think what we've seen really is a growth of growth orientated managers. You don't see very many value managers out there, and it's because a lot of them have underperformed for the last 20 years.
Okay.
What I'm probably not seeing is a lot of managers who outperform in both value and growth orientated markets, because a lot of them for the last 10 years, other than a little peak through the end of COVID, haven't actually needed to outperform in anything but growth markets. So my bit is trying to work on what are your strengths. Strengths might be fundamental research, could be quantitative, could be the ability to bring those together, could be looking at behavioural finance, but working at how you can find a competitive edge and how you can make that competitive edge repeatable, and also that competitive edge not only has to be repeatable but also scalable. And scalable in terms of investment process, then scalable in terms of the narrative you can put around that, and then scalable as a business you can grow from that. And that's where running a business, not just an investment process, is also extremely rewarding, because it becomes a multifaceted role, and they can take a lot of time and effort. And I think one of the things we do have to realise is that it's hard to be great at everything. So the ability, once again, to have good people around you to leverage and help is also very important. I think that's probably one of my learnings is you can be good at most things. It's hard to be great at everything. So do get those good people around you that help you on a journey.
And I can hear that little entrepreneurial fire that's burning inside of you there, James. That passion for being good at what you're good at, but that passion to build a business, passion to see a business succeed, passion for the holistic approach of yes, running good portfolios, yes, being kind of the head of an equity space, but also that real commercial sense and understanding of wanting to grow a business, wanting to see it succeed, wanting everyone around you to be successful. Great to hear that coming through.
Yeah, I'd sort of hope that's a desire that most people probably have. It comes back to the fact if you're in this sort of area, then, as I said earlier, every day is different. You're in a dynamic industry. You're not pushing the same button every day to produce a widget. So the ability to think on your feet, be dynamic, to be responsive, to allocate your own time. And that's probably one of the other things is, what are you allocating your time to today? What's happened in markets? Are you being reactive? And sometimes, you will be reactive. But sometimes, a lot of the time you want to be proactive. What am I finding out there? How am I using my competitive edge to do that? And whether that's the investment process or the business itself, they're the sort of things that, you really, attributes I would look for anyway in individuals. How can I be proactive in thinking about what I'm doing next, rather than just reacting and doing what I'm told to do?
Yeah. James, great overview. You mentioned you're in startup mode again. What are you starting?
Staying in the financial services, but doing looking much more in the insurance markets at the moment, and looking and focusing on the areas of technology, Web3, blockchain orientated companies, and looking to provide solutions in those areas on a global basis. So once again, we'll be operating in an area that is regulated, not necessarily out of Australia, but globally regulated market. It's a large market, and once again, working with a couple of other individuals where you're able to bring together different skill sets and attributes, and that's very powerful. To get to where we are, I didn't have all the skill sets to do it, and the ability to actually bring that together once again is very powerful. For us, it's a very exciting venture and something we're looking forward to doing. But to me, what it proves is you've got to try and think and not sit still. So my initial thesis on this was looking at markets and thinking, all right, and you might remember about 2 years ago, 2.5, 3 years ago, you had both equity markets and bond markets basically falling at the same time. So negative returns being generated by both. And that correlation in those two doesn't happen very often. They are normally very lowly correlated and sometimes negatively correlated, and hence why you used to have 60-40 bond portfolios being the initial It's all precursor of, all balanced funds. Where I looked at sort of the insurance markets and reinsurance markets and areas like that, and what you see is uncorrelated returns, the ability to, why Warren Buffett loves these areas, because insurance tends to be cash flow positive, because market and money, you get premiums in the door, and then obviously very simply, you pay claims out. And the ability to look at that on a global scale is, to me, very important. Why is that? I think we're going through a period of, there's a lot of unknowns out there. I'm not just thinking about the US, but also very high regulations, both here, UK, US markets have gone through 20 years of increasing regulation. I think if we look at banks, probably one of the areas they've added to most in the last 20 years is compliance teams.
Yeah.
And good compliance, good regulations are good. Ones that just make things overly onerous and expensive and put up barriers to entry in markets are bad. And I think it's probably it's probably something Australia needs to think about. Is we've got a lot of good regulation and compliance laws, and there's probably some areas where we're actually hindering ourselves and hindering new businesses coming into markets. And I think. So I always look at that and think, you never want to be anti-regulation, but what you want in place is good regulation, good legislation, good compliance teams, making sure you have businesses that live up to that and have best of breed culture. And as a firm, what we're setting up, regulated markets, we have to make sure we tick all those boxes, and it's key. But I think here in Australia, there's definitely been a period of significant increases in regulation in the last 20 years that have made doing business harder.
So, mate, interested to hear your thoughts as someone who's spent a lot of time in public markets about the rise we're seeing in private markets, and I look at in kind of the modern era, Canva is in some ways the poster child of a massive organization that has stayed private. Historically, to kind of get to that size and get access to the capital you need, you had to go public. Short of a few other potential routes, but generally you would have had to go public. What are we kind of seeing here in the rise of private markets?
I think the rise of private markets are wonderful because it gives, I'll come back to your question, but what it does is it supplies differentiated capital to companies. And one of the things that Australia, I think, has always struggled with relative to, let's say, bigger markets like the UK and US, is access to capital. There's just far more points of access to capital in markets like the US and the UK relative to Australia. So the growth of private markets, firstly, I think, on top looking down, I think is fabulous because it's in different areas of capital. And small startup businesses don't want to be listed, and nor should they be. Listing for some companies at different points is exactly the right thing to do, but it's not for everybody. It comes with expense, regulation, it comes with scrutiny, it comes with quarterly reporting, it comes with a whole myriad of things. Some companies should be doing it totally, and some shouldn't. So I think the rise of private markets has been fabulous because it's just given other pools of capital for people to draw from, for people who have good ideas, whether it's on entrepreneurs on the private equity side or whether it's ability to put credit in the market, for people who couldn't access money through banks in the private credit markets. But to me, private equity, venture capital, that whole area is really driven by the opportunity that there are entrepreneurs out there, there are great ideas out there that probably weren't getting to market earlier that was something worth having a shot at. The private credit market has always been there, but it's grown as, once again, there's a lot of regulation around banks. So banks really are quite happy to leave that market that they probably once did fill to an extent. And now we've had the growth of private credit, certainly in the Australian market and also globally. So quite different, probably driving themes in some ways. But as an umbrella, what we're seeing is now more capital in the market as a whole. And if that capital is allocated well, then that's a great positive overall, not only for those individuals who receive capital, but also for those individuals who hopefully get a return on that capital, but also for the wider economy. Hopefully it creates employment, furthers opportunities, not only for individuals, but for the corporates, for the country. It might be based in everything else. Capital in itself is actually, in the growth of capital through private markets, I think is fabulous. You just obviously want that capital to be allocated in a manner that hopefully generates an economic return and also gives you great outcomes. And some of those outcomes can be social. Not every outcome it probably is tied to economics at the end, but not every outcome is purely economics. There can be some social outcomes too, and the ability to help drive both of those is something I think private markets are probably far more adept at doing than public markets.
Yeah, and we're probably seeing that most at the moment with social housing.
Yeah, that's a great area. We've had build to rent come through, we've had social housing, and the problem is once you do these areas, the economic return might be reduced. Touched my point before, there can be social outcomes which are hugely beneficial not only to those individuals, but maybe the wider societies. They've been a beneficiary of that, and that's good. And it probably also comes to my point that now we have more pots of capital to draw from. And the equity market, public market in many ways is about that economic return, where private markets, because they are private in nature, can take a differentiated view on what are the elements they're looking for in return. And I said that return can be economic, but it could be a mixture of economic and social, it could be purely social. And in many ways, that's, I suppose, what government does at different points. They want to make sure they're getting an economic return, hopefully, in what they're investing in. But different points, they also have to put money into things that generate a social benefit too.
Yeah. And so then, James, where do you think we're going to see the kind of most growth in the world of funds, asset management, markets over the next sort of 3 to 5 years? Where are those? Yeah, where are we going to see the most growth?
The most growth in terms of assets being put towards it or returns. And I probably won't talk about returns because that then takes into the muddy waters of giving financial advice, or could do. So that's certainly not something we're doing here.
That's it. We're not looking for investment advice.
No, we're not
just,
giving any
areas that will.
Look, I think what continues to happen is you're getting more and more money looking for a home. And in Australia, it's easy. You can see the growth of superannuation funds. And they need to allocate a bigger and bigger pool. We have a forced saving regime here, and it's good. I want us all to be saving something for our retirement. So, and it takes pressure off government, blah, blah, blah. But that money has to find a home. And we have seen in public markets de-equitisation over the last 30 plus years. So equity markets, other than maybe a spike recently as a sort of Magnificent Seven grew exponentially, well, not exponentially, but very quickly over the last few years. Generally, there's been a de-equitisation of equity markets. So that has also helped the growth of private markets. So I suspect private markets continue to grow, infrastructure continues to grow, alternative assets continue to grow as asset allocators look for different opportunities and assets that have a lower correlation. We'll go with lower. Obviously, everyone will be looking for different things, but a lower correlation with maybe equity markets. So I suspect alternatives, we'll call it alternatives, tend to grow as a percentage of the pie. Infrastructure, long duration assets, maybe that's the other way to look at it. The ability to continue to invest in long duration assets, and that was very much seen when everything was defined benefit. You very much had that duration, trying to match that duration of your long-term assets with your long-term liabilities. Most of our pension schemes are defined contribution these days, and it's not quite such an alignment between asset lives, if you will, between the assets and the liabilities, but long-term duration assets, airports, we've done them to death, but there will be more airports building in the world, power, whether it be bridges, roads. So all these areas for pension funds will remain in play. And now, pension funds are big enough, as the top 10 have been for a while, they're owning individual stakes in it. So that's the other maturing thing you're seeing, selling the superannuation here sector, but globally within pension funds is a maturing where they are now the new asset managers. They are managing. They'll call themselves asset owners, but frankly, the people owning the assets are actually the members behind it.
Yeah.
But at the end of the day, they're growing up, or they've grown up, and they have the ability now to own these assets in their own right, rather than through let's call it schemes or equity markets. And that is a trend we will see continue because they're too big for equity markets at the moment, and that's why alts will continue to grow. And when I say alts, I mean alts holistically and very broadly.
Yeah. And James, you're mentioning de-equitisation. What does that actually mean at a practical level?
It just means fewer companies are listing on the equity markets and public markets. So it was interesting if you went back to the late 90s, or early noughties, the UK market was probably one of the fastest growing markets in the world with the LSE because you had Sarbanes-Oxley over-regulation in the US and it was becoming too onerous to list there. They eventually got rid of Sarbanes-Oxley in the US, rejoined its growth program. But companies now look at equity markets and think, my God, it's very onerous with a lot of risk, especially small companies, by the way. And I put Australian miners in a totally different bracket. I'm not. It's a generalisation comment, not a specific comment. But also, as we've just been discussing, that growth in private markets means there's other pools of capital out there. You're seeing growth in private equity and venture capital, which is taking up more share, and those areas have matured as well. And you've got great hardworking professionals in those alternative markets, such as private equity and venture capital, who you are far more focused on specifics of knowing their area, backing founders, but working hand in hand with them. And that's something you don't necessarily get in the public markets, is the ability to actually work closely with someone to bring expertise that you may not actually have. So if you're partnering with a VC or private equity firm, it's not just investment in there, it's a partnership. And that's, I think, something that differentiates itself from public markets, is ability to pull expertise from them, to work hand in hand with them, and you're on a journey together. And that's that alignment, I think, is a big point of difference relative to public markets. That you can get that, especially as a small company. Large companies are a very different beast, but as a smaller company, once again, it's hard to be great at everything. So the ability to have good people around you is very important, and I think that is a void that some good private equity and venture capital firms really do fill very well.
And James, last one for today before we wrap up. Talk to me about kind of the biggest thing that you're seeing moving in both technology and regulation and kind of those two spaces together. What are some of the big kind of themes happening through there?
Themes. Okay, themes. We obviously know the biggest tech theme is AI, and then the one below that, I think, is blockchain and decentralization. And what we may see, I think there's a good chance we'll see it over the next couple of years, is a convergence within there. Because think of blockchain as more of a platform. And what we're seeing with AI models coming out of, let's say, China or the US, there's inherent biases within them. You might have something that's produced in the US and will have a bias to those programmers who have built it. Likewise, something coming out of China might have an inherent bias there. So AI is far from perfect. And one thing that may see a convergence, it's not necessarily there at the moment, is that having decentralized areas of information, which blockchain allows you to do, and having that security and authenticity through the blockchain may allow AI to actually get rid of some of those inherent biases that may have come through its development. So those are the areas in technology I think are very interesting currently. You mentioned regulation. I'm not a lawyer, I'm not a compliance expert. I live within, and for my life, I've lived within compliance frameworks and managed to obviously do my bit to make sure I'm always staying compliant within them, as I would recommend everyone does. But I think what we're going to see coming out of the US with the new administration is obviously they have backed crypto. Crypto brings with a number of challenges, but it's an unregulated market, and the ability to put regulation around that. You might remember I said earlier, good regulation is good. Over-regulation that stalls businesses and incurs costs is not great. Regulation actually legitimizes things and makes sure that people can actually operate on a highway, if you will, with barriers on either side, and that's what you want. So I'd be seeing generally deregulation probably coming out of the US under this administration, and that may not sort of force some of the other world to follow. But on the flip side, we might start to see some regulation coming through in that sort of crypto space, which would go a long way to legitimising it to an extent. And as I said, that would be good regulation because it's needed in that area. So at the moment, it's still early days, even though it's been around for a while. So I would see that as they might be changes that happen over the next few years. But there's probably a few lawyers out there who are looking at this space, or compliance experts or regulators who are a step in front of me on that.
Ever changing world. Feels like blockchain is at some level the sleeping base that sat underneath crypto for a few years there, and I think people were fascinated by the rise of the coins, and we had this kind of weird let's not go on to crypto, but this weird kind of super cycle of meme coins, and to an extent people have lost a little bit of sight on the underlying technology here and the many use cases for it.
And I think you are spot on there. And I was, listening to a speech the other day, a very smart lady out of a venture capital firm in, I think out of Sydney, and she was saying it was a great pity that the first initial use of blockchain actually happened to be sort of crypto exchanges, because I suppose I put it into that area. But what a person I work very closely with on a new venture, business partner, said there's what he calls the computer class and the casino class, and the computer class is very interesting. Whether it's decentralized finance, whether it's looking at tokens, for instance, whether it's in the gaming sphere. So one of the things we really talk about in Web3, for instance, and the rise of Web3 is the ability to own your own information on the blockchain. And if you're into gaming, for instance, and when I say gaming, I don't mean the old one-armed bandit in the pub. I'm talking about proper gaming. And if you're into gaming, it has the ability, in Web3, you have the ability to actually store and have your own information. And that information can then be fungible. You may be able to sell it, for instance. So, whereas at the moment, all that information will be stored with the owner of that game, or information might be stored on server somewhere with Google or whoever else. And that's where Web 1 was all about a stagnant web page that you went and just read. Web 2 is where we've been for the last 15, 20 years, which is interaction with a web page. And Web 3 is taking Web 2 and adding that ability to decentralize information, to own the information yourself, control it, make it fungible. And that's an exciting area of technology going forward. So that's a great thing about financial markets. Whether they're at the center of it quite often, but normally they're at least at the periphery of it. And because whether they need capital funding into these areas, financial markets is still one of the biggest areas globally for international trade. So that's probably full circle to one of the earlier comments, that every day is different, every day is dynamic, and it's one of the areas of reasons to be working in these areas.
That's it.
Yes.
That's it. Well, awesome, James. We'll leave it there before we start going into the whole world of Web3, blockchain, crypto, and run absolutely down the rabbit hole.
Yep, very cool.
Mate, it's been an absolute pleasure hearing your story, having you on. I so appreciate your time. Thank you so much.
Daniel, absolute pleasure. And hopefully I didn't say anything too controversial.